The rain mixed with blood on my hands as she collapsed in front of me, pregnant, barely breathing, and I knew if she died, I wouldn't make it out alive either, so I pressed my hands harder, whispered stay with me, please stay with me. Until the doors burst open and he walked in, suit flawless, eyes cold enough to stop my heart. Luca Moretti didn't thank me, didn't even look at her first. He looked at me and said quietly, you just changed your life, and the next morning my bruises were gone. My past erased, and that's when I realized. I wasn't rescued, I was chosen. If she dies, you don't walk away, someone whispered behind me, but all I could hear was the rain hitting the pavement and the uneven rhythm of her breathing beneath my hands as I pressed harder against her stomach, trying to remember every first aid class I had ever taken while my own pulse roared in my ears. I wasn't supposed to be here, not at 2:17 a.m. in a nearly empty parking lot behind a closed grocery store on the edge of Brooklyn, but running had become second nature to me lately. Running from raised voices, from doors slamming too hard, from the kind of silence that came right before everything went wrong, and somehow that running led me straight to her, a stranger in a pale dress now soaked with rain, her fingers clutching weakly at my sleeve as she whispered something I couldn't understand, something soft and urgent. And when I realized she was pregnant, visibly, undeniably, my fear didn't disappear, it sharpened. Because now it wasn't just one life slipping through my fingers, it was two. Stay with me, I whispered, my voice shaking despite how hard I tried to keep it steady. Help is coming, okay, just stay with me, even though I hadn't called anyone yet, even though my phone sat forgotten somewhere in my pocket because the idea of letting go, even for a second, felt like choosing to lose her. And I couldn't do that, not again, not after everything I had already failed to fix in my own life. Her hand tightened suddenly, nails pressing into my skin with surprising strength, and for a moment her eyes opened, dark and unfocused but searching, locking onto mine like I was the only thing keeping her anchored, and maybe I was, maybe in that moment I was the only thing standing between her and something irreversible, so I leaned closer, ignoring the cold rain soaking through my jacket, ignoring the distant sound of a car approaching, ignoring the voice in my head telling me to step back, to leave, to not get involved, because getting involved always had consequences, but I stayed, I always stayed, that was my problem, wasn't it? I stayed and I tried and I paid for it later. The sound of tires on wet asphalt grew louder, headlights cutting through the darkness and forcing me to squint, and for a split second I thought help had finally arrived, but something about the way the car stopped, too smooth, too controlled, made my stomach drop. The doors opened almost in sync, 3 men stepping out, all in dark suits that didn't belong in a place like this at this hour, and then him, last to exit, slower, deliberate, like time itself adjusted to match his pace, tall, composed. Untouched by the rain as if it knew better than to fall on him, his gaze didn't go to her first, it went to me, and I felt it before I fully met his eyes, that weight, that awareness. Like he was reading every decision I had ever made in the span of a single breath. I froze, my hands still pressed against her, my heart stuttering in a way that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with something deeper, something instinctive. And when he finally spoke, his voice low, controlled, it didn't sound like a question, it sounded like a verdict. Why are you touching what belongs to me? And in that moment, kneeling in the rain with a stranger's life in my hands and a man who looked like he owned everything standing in front of me, I realized something I couldn't yet explain. Saving her might have been the first choice I made. That I wouldn't be allowed to undo his words did not feel like a question. They felt like something closing around me, something I could not see but already understood, and for a second I forgot how to breathe, my hands still pressed against her as I looked up at him fully, rain sliding down my face, mixing with the tension building in my chest. She is not breathing right, I said instead, my voice quieter than I expected but steady enough to hold, because whatever he was, whoever he was, that did not matter if she slipped away in front of me. Something in his expression shifted, not softer, never soft, but sharper, more focused, like he had decided I was worth listening to for exactly one moment. He stepped closer and the air changed with him, not louder, not dramatic, just heavier, like everything else instinctively made space. Sophia, he said her name once, and suddenly she reacted, a faint movement, a breath that caught and struggled, and I felt it under my hands, that fragile fight still there. Stay with me, I whispered again, this time not just for her, but because I needed her to stay for myself too, because something told me if she did not, This man in front of me would not forget my face. One of the men behind him moved quickly, already on the phone, speaking in low, precise words I could not fully catch, but I heard enough. Ambulance, private entrance, clear the route. Everything about them moved with quiet efficiency, no panic, no wasted motion, and it made me realize just how far out of my world I had stepped. I was still kneeling on cold concrete, my jeans soaked through, my fingers numb from the pressure I refused to release, and yet they all stood like this was controlled, expected, almost routine. Except for him, he did not look away from me, not once, even when another man crouched beside Sophia to check her pulse, even when headlights appeared again in the distance signaling help was actually coming. His attention stayed locked on me like I had become part of the situation he needed to solve. "Why did you stay?" he asked, quieter now, and that question unsettled me more than the first, because I did not have an answer that made sense in his world. I swallowed, feeling the weight of every choice that had led me here pressing against my ribs. "Because no one else was here," I said, and it sounded too simple, too small, but it was the truth. He held my gaze for a long second, and something unreadable flickered behind his eyes. Not approval, not kindness, something closer to recognition, like he had just confirmed something he had suspected. The ambulance lights finally washed over us in flashes of red and white, breaking the moment apart. Paramedics rushing in, voices rising, hands replacing mine as they carefully lifted her onto a stretcher. And only then did I realize how much my arms were shaking, how cold I had become. I pulled back slowly, my fingers leaving her like I was letting go of something fragile that might shatter without me, and for the first time since this started, I felt the edge of doubt creep in. Maybe I should leave now, disappear before whatever this was followed me home. But when I tried to stand, my legs hesitated, like even my body understood something I had not fully accepted yet, that leaving was no longer simple. "You are coming," he said, not loud, not forceful, but absolute, and I looked at him, really looked this time, at the way the men around him waited without question, at the way even the paramedics seemed to move just slightly faster in his presence, and I knew, without being told, that this was not an invitation. I shook my head before I could stop myself. I did what I could. "She is with them now. I should go." The words felt fragile the moment they left my mouth, like they did not belong in this space. His expression did not change, but he stepped closer, just enough to close the distance I had tried to create, and his voice dropped slightly, calm, certain. "You do not understand," he said. "You were seen with her, you touched her, you are part of this now." Something in my chest tightened, not fear exactly, something deeper, something that felt like a door quietly locking behind me. And as the ambulance doors closed with Sophia inside and the lights began to move away, I realized he was right. Not because of what had happened, but because of what was about to happen next. And when he reached for my wrist, not rough, not forceful, just firm enough to stop me from stepping back, I did not pull away, not because I trusted him, but because some part of me already knew. My life before this moment had ended the second I chose to stay. The moment his fingers closed around my wrist, the world narrowed to that single point of contact, not painful, not harsh, but impossible to ignore. Like gravity had suddenly shifted and I was caught in its pull. I should have stepped back, should have said no, should have reminded myself that I did not belong in whatever world he came from. But my body did not move. My thoughts tangled somewhere between exhaustion and something I could not name. "I have to go home," I said, the words quieter now, less certain than before, and for the first time since he appeared, his gaze softened just slightly, not in warmth, but in understanding, like he had heard those words before from people who did not realize how little they meant anymore. "Home is not where you think it is," he replied, releasing my wrist only to gesture toward the waiting car behind him, sleek, black, untouched by the chaos that had just unfolded, the door already open as if it had been waiting for this exact moment. I hesitated, my eyes flickering toward the direction the ambulance had gone, the flashing lights now distant, carrying her away, carrying the only reason I had stayed in the first place, and suddenly I felt empty, like the purpose that had anchored me minutes ago had disappeared, leaving me exposed in a situation I did not understand. "She will live," he said, reading the question I had not spoken, and something in my chest loosened, just enough to breathe again, but it did not last, because his next words settled heavier. "Because you were there." I shook my head instinctively, rejecting the weight he was placing on me. "I just did what anyone would do," I said, but even as I spoke, I knew it was not true. Not everyone stopped, not everyone stayed, not everyone chose to get involved when walking away was easier. His expression did not change, but there was something final in the way he looked at me now, like a decision had been made and there was no longer any reason to question it. No, he said quietly, not everyone. The man beside him stepped forward slightly, waiting, not pushing, just present, and I realized this was the moment, the last moment where I could still turn around and pretend none of this had happened. I could walk away, go back to my small apartment, to the life that felt safe only because it was familiar, but as that thought formed, another followed, clearer, sharper, reminding me of the silence in that apartment, the tension that lingered in every room, the version of myself that had been shrinking day by day just to keep the peace. And suddenly that life did not feel safe at all. It felt like something I had already been trying to escape without admitting it. I looked back at him, really looked this time, at the control in his posture, the quiet authority that did not need to be proven. And for the first time, I wondered if stepping into his world was not the danger, but the change I had been avoiding. My breath steadied, slow and deliberate, as I made a choice that did not feel like courage, just inevitability. I stepped toward the car, the sound of my shoes against the wet pavement louder than it should have been, and as I passed him, close enough to feel the faint warmth of his presence despite the cold rain, he spoke again, softer now, meant only for me. From this moment on, you do not face anything alone. The words should have comforted me, but instead they settled somewhere deeper, somewhere uncertain, because I did not know if they were a promise or a warning. The door closed behind me with a quiet, definitive sound, and as the car began to move, pulling me away from everything I had known, I pressed my hands together in my lap, still feeling the ghost of her pulse beneath my fingers and the imprint of his grip on my wrist, and for the first time since this began, I allowed myself to ask the question I had been avoiding, not who he was, not what he wanted, but what exactly I had just stepped into, because something told me this was not a rescue. It was the beginning of something I would not be able to walk away from. The city lights blurred past the window like something unreal, streaks of white and gold stretching across the glass as the car moved smoothly through streets I barely recognized. And I sat there with my hands still in my lap, fingers curled slightly like they remembered holding on to something important. No one spoke, not the driver, not the man beside me, and especially not him. He sat across from me in silence, one arm resting casually against the door, his posture relaxed but his presence filling every inch of space. I could feel his attention without looking, like a quiet pressure against my skin, and I told myself not to meet his eyes, not to invite whatever came with that kind of focus. But after a few minutes that felt like hours, I failed. I looked up, and of course he was already watching me, not surprised, not caught, just waiting. Where are you taking me? I asked, my voice steadier now, because fear had started to shift into something else, something more controlled, something that needed answers. He did not respond immediately. His gaze lingered for a second longer before he glanced out the window, as if confirming something only he could see. Somewhere safe, he said finally. And the word safe settled strangely in my chest, not comforting, not entirely, because I realized his version of safe might not look anything like mine. I was safe before, I said, the words slipping out before I could stop them, and the silence that followed felt different, heavier, like I had said something that mattered more than I intended. He turned his attention back to me slowly, his expression unreadable but sharper now. No, he said quietly, you were surviving. The correction hit deeper than I expected, because it was true in a way I had never said out loud. I looked away again, focusing on the passing lights, but they no longer looked distant. They looked like something I was leaving behind, something I could not return to even if I wanted to. The car slowed after what felt like miles, turning onto a quieter street lined with buildings that did not look like anything I had ever been inside. Tall, polished, guarded without being obvious. The gates opened before we even reached them, like whoever was inside already knew we were coming. Of course they did. Everything about him suggested nothing happened without his knowledge. The car came to a smooth stop beneath a covered entrance, and before I could decide how I felt about that, the door opened and cool air replaced the confined silence. I hesitated again, just for a second, because stepping out felt like crossing something invisible but permanent. Emily. He said my name for the first time, and it stopped me completely. I had never told Him, I was sure of that, and the way he said it was not questioning, it was certain, like he had known it before I ever spoke. Slowly, I turned back toward him, my heart picking up in a way that had nothing to do with running or fear. How do you know that? I asked, and he held my gaze without hesitation. Because when something becomes important to me, he said calmly, I make sure I know everything about it. The word important echoed in my mind, not comforting, not reassuring, just heavy. With meaning I was not ready to understand. I stepped out of the car before I could overthink it, my shoes meeting dry stone this time instead of rain-soaked pavement, the contrast almost disorienting. Inside, everything was quiet, controlled, warm in a way that felt intentional rather than welcoming, and as I followed him without being told to, I realized something I had been avoiding since the moment I stayed in that parking lot. This was not about gratitude, not about a favor repaid. This was something else entirely, something that had started the second he saw me kneeling there, and as the doors closed behind us with a soft, final sound, I understood that whatever this place was, whatever he intended, I was no longer just the girl who helped. I was now part of a world that did not let people walk away. The doors closed behind me with a soft sound that felt louder than it should have, like it marked something I could not undo, and for a moment I just stood there, unsure if I was supposed to move or wait or speak. The space around me was nothing like the world I came from. Everything was clean, precise, quiet in a way that did not feel empty but controlled, like every detail had been chosen on purpose. Even the air felt different, warmer, steadier, as if chaos was not allowed past the entrance. You can breathe here. His voice came from behind me, low and certain, and I did not realize how tense my shoulders were until they dropped slightly at the sound. I turned slowly, finding him a few steps away, already watching me like he had been the entire time. I am breathing, I said, but the words sounded weaker than I meant them to, because something about this place made it harder to hold on to the version of myself I had walked in with. He studied me for a moment, then nodded once, as if acknowledging something I had not said out loud. That will change, he replied, and before I could ask what that meant, another person approached, a woman this time, composed, professional, carrying a small tablet in her hand like she already knew why I was here. Of course she did. Everyone here seemed to know things before they were spoken. Miss Carter, she said politely, and hearing my name again from someone else made my chest tighten in a different way, not fear exactly, more like the realization that my life had already been opened and examined without my permission. We have prepared a room for you, she continued, her tone calm, neutral, like this was routine, like people like me arrived here all the time. I almost laughed at that thought, because nothing about this felt normal. I looked back at him, searching for something, permission, maybe, or explanation, but he only gave me a slight nod, not forcing, not insisting, just expecting, and somehow that was harder to resist. I followed her down a long hallway, my footsteps softer now against the polished floor, my mind racing in the background with questions I could not organize. The room she led me to was larger than my entire apartment, warm lighting, soft textures, everything in its place, nothing out of line, and for a second I just stood at the doorway, not stepping in, because it felt like crossing another invisible line. You should rest, she said gently, setting something down on the table. A change of clothes has been provided. I glanced at the neatly folded items, simple, clean, nothing extravagant but far beyond anything I owned. Thank you, I said automatically, even though the words felt misplaced, because gratitude did not quite fit what this was. She gave a small nod and left without another word, the door closing quietly behind her, leaving me alone for the first time since everything started. I exhaled slowly, the sound louder in the silence, and walked further into the room, my fingers brushing lightly against the fabric on the bed, soft, untouched. And suddenly I felt the weight of everything hit me at once, the rain, the blood, her hand gripping mine, his voice cutting through it all, and now this place that did not feel like a reward or a rescue but something in between, something I could not define. I moved toward the mirror without thinking, stopping when I saw my reflection, damp hair, tired eyes, the faint marks I had tried to ignore for weeks now still visible against my skin, reminders of a life I had not fully left behind. And for a moment I wondered if he had seen them too, if that was part of why I was here, or if it had nothing to do with me at all. I reached up, brushing a strand of hair away from my face, and that was when I noticed it. My wrist, the one he had held, still felt different, like the memory of his grip had not faded, And I could not explain why that unsettled me more than everything else. A soft knock interrupted my thoughts, and before I could respond, the door opened slightly, just enough for him to step inside. He did not look around, did not take in the room. His attention went straight to me, like it always did. "You are still standing," he said, not as a question, more like an observation that carried meaning beneath it. I crossed my arms without realizing it, grounding myself. "I am not sure what I am supposed to do," I admitted, honesty slipping out easier than I expected. He took a step closer, not invading, just enough to close the distance slightly. "You do not have to do anything tonight," he said, his voice quieter now, less sharp but no less certain. "Tonight, you stay." The words settled over me slowly, simple on the surface, but carrying something deeper underneath, because staying had always been my weakness, my pattern, the thing that kept me trapped where I did not belong, and yet this time felt different, not because I trusted him, but because I sensed that leaving was no longer an option I truly had. I held his gaze for a second longer before looking away, my voice barely above a whisper. "And tomorrow?" I asked, and when I looked back at him, there was something in his eyes I had not seen before, something quieter, more deliberate. "Tomorrow," he said calmly, "we decide what your life looks like now, and..." That was the moment I realized this was not temporary. This was not a favor that would fade with time. This was something that had already taken root, something that was going to change everything whether I was ready or not. I did not sleep, not really. I lay there in a bed that felt too soft, too unfamiliar, staring at the ceiling while every second stretched longer than it should have. Because silence here was not the same as silence at home. It did not carry tension or warning, it carried expectation, like something was waiting for me to understand it, and that made it harder to rest. I turned onto my side, pulling the blanket slightly closer even though the room was perfectly warm, and for the first time in a long time, there were no sounds through the walls, no footsteps pacing, no voices rising, no sudden shifts that made my body tense without thinking, and that absence should have felt like relief, but instead it left space for thoughts I had been avoiding. I thought about her, Sophia, the way her hand had tightened around mine, the way her breath had struggled, and then I thought about him, the way he had looked at me like I had already become something in his world without being asked, and somewhere between those two memories, I realized something uncomfortable. I was not here by accident. Morning came slowly, light filtering through curtains that softened everything it touched, and for a moment I forgot where I was, that brief, fragile second where everything felt normal, until I sat up and the room reminded me all at once, the clothes folded neatly, the unfamiliar space, the quiet that did not belong to me. I pushed the blanket aside and stood, my feet meeting the floor carefully like I expected it to shift beneath me, but it did not. Nothing here felt unstable. Everything was steady in a way that made me feel like the unstable part instead. I changed into the clothes they had left, simple, comfortable, but still not mine, and that detail stayed with me longer than it should have, because wearing something provided by him felt like stepping further into something I had not agreed to. A soft knock came at the door, precise, controlled, and I already knew who it would be before it opened. He stepped inside without hesitation, dressed the same as before, composed, untouched by time or rest, like he did not need either. His eyes moved over me once, not lingering, just observing, and then back to my face. "You did not leave," he said, and I frowned slightly, the statement catching me off guard. "You told me to stay," I replied, and he nodded once, like that confirmed something important. "Most people would still try to run," he said, and I crossed my arms lightly, not defensive, just grounding myself again. I thought about it, I admitted, because lying felt pointless here. He stepped closer, not enough to crowd me, just enough to shift the space again. "And why did you not?" he asked, and the question settled deeper than I expected. Because I did not have a simple answer. I looked down for a second, then back at him, choosing honesty again. "Because I do not think running would change anything," I said, and for the first time, something in his expression shifted into something almost like approval, not warm, not soft, but recognizing. "That is correct," he said quietly, then turned slightly, gesturing toward the door. "Come." There was no explanation, no detail, just expectation. And I hesitated for half a second before following, because that seemed to be the pattern now, hesitation followed by movement. We walked through the same quiet halls, but this time it felt different, less overwhelming, more intentional, like I was being shown something rather than Brought somewhere without choice, he stopped outside a large set of doors, placing his hand briefly against the surface before they opened, and when I stepped inside, I saw her, Sophia, lying in a hospital bed that looked nothing like the ones I was used to. Pale but stable, her breathing steady, machines around her quiet instead of urgent. Relief hit me before I could stop it, a deep, steady release I had been holding since the night before. I took a step forward without thinking, drawn by that confirmation that she was still here, still fighting, and as I stood there, watching her, I felt his presence beside me again, close but not intrusive. She asked about you, he said, his voice lower now, almost private, and I glanced at him, surprised. She does not remember much, he continued, but she remembers your voice. Something in my chest tightened at that, not fear, not pressure, something else, something that felt like connection in a place I did not expect it. I looked back at her, then down at my hands, still remembering the weight of that moment, and quietly, without fully understanding why, I whispered, I am glad she stayed, and beside me, he responded just as quietly, so am I. But there was something in the way he said it that made me realize he was not only talking about her. She looked smaller in the bed than she had in the rain. Like the chaos of that night had stretched her presence into something larger than life, and now reality had settled back around her, fragile but steady, and I stood there longer than I meant to, watching the rise and fall of her breathing as if I needed to memorize it, to prove to myself that it was real, that she had made it through. You can go closer, he said beside me, his voice low enough that it did not disturb the quiet of the room. I hesitated, not because I was afraid of her, but because stepping closer felt like crossing into something personal, something I was not sure I had the right to enter, but my feet moved anyway, slow, careful, until I was close enough to see the details I had missed before. The faint tension in her brow even in rest, the way her hand rested protectively over her stomach, instinct even in sleep. I felt something shift inside me then, something protective, something that had nothing to do with him or this place, just a quiet recognition of her strength. She is strong, I said softly, more to myself than to him, but he heard it. Of course he did, he always did. She has to be, he replied, and there was something in his tone that made me glance at him again. Not just control this time, but something deeper, something tied to her in a way I could not yet understand. I looked back at Sophia, then slowly reached out, stopping just short of touching her hand, unsure if I should, unsure if I was allowed, and then her fingers moved slightly, barely noticeable, but enough that I let my hand rest gently over hers, light, careful, and for a second, nothing happened, and then her fingers curled just a little, like she recognized the contact even in sleep, and my breath caught quietly. She remembers, I whispered, and beside me, he did not respond immediately. When he did, his voice was softer than I had heard it before. She trusts easily, he said, and something about that did not feel like a compliment, more like a concern. I withdrew my hand slowly, not wanting to disturb her, and stepped back, the space between us returning but not feeling as distant as before. I turned slightly, facing him again. Will she be okay? I asked, because even though everything around me suggested she would be, I needed to hear it, needed the certainty. He held my gaze for a moment, then nodded once, firm, yes, he said, and that single word carried more weight than anything else he had said so far. Because it was not a guess, it was a decision. I exhaled slowly, tension I had been holding finally easing in a way I could feel in my shoulders, in my chest, in the way my hands no longer felt like they needed to hold on to something. We stood there in silence for a few seconds more, and for the first time since I met him, the silence did not feel heavy, it felt shared, like we were both acknowledging something without needing to say it. But that feeling did not last. Because reality has a way of returning when you least expect it. There is something you need to understand, he said suddenly, and the shift in his tone was immediate, pulling me back into awareness. I looked at him, waiting, my body instinctively tensing again, not from fear exactly, but from anticipation. He stepped slightly closer, just enough to remind me of the difference between us, the control he carried so naturally. What happened last night does not stay there, he continued, his voice calm but deliberate. You were seen, you were involved, and that changes things. My stomach tightened slightly, the words settling into place in a way that made it clear this was not over, not even close. I did not ask for that, I said quietly, not as a protest, just a statement, and he nodded once, like he expected that answer. I know, he replied, and then, after a brief pause that felt intentional, but it Does not matter. The honesty of it caught me off guard, not softened, not explained away, just stated, and I realized then that this was the difference between his world and mine. In my world, intentions mattered, in his, outcomes did. I looked back at Sophia for a moment, grounding myself in something that still felt real, something that still made sense, and then back at him. So what happens now? I asked, and this time, when he answered, there was no hesitation, no pause, just certainty. Now, he said, his eyes steady on mine, we make sure nothing touches you because of it. The words should have felt reassuring, but instead they settled deeper, heavier, because protection from someone like him did not come without meaning, without expectation. And as I stood there, between the quiet of the hospital room and the weight of his promise, I realized something I could not ignore anymore. I was no longer just connected to what happened. I was now part of what came next. His words stayed with me even after we left the room, echoing in a way that made everything feel slightly different, like the air itself had shifted around me. And as we walked back through the quiet hallway, I found myself more aware of every step, every glance from the people we passed, subtle, respectful, but never curious, like questions were not allowed to exist in this place. Nothing touches you, I repeated quietly, more to understand it than to challenge it, and he did not slow down, did not look back. Correct, he said, simple, certain, and something about the way he answered made it clear this was not a promise he hoped to keep, it was one he already controlled. We stepped outside into the open air again, the contrast immediate, the world beyond these walls louder, less contained, and for the first time since last night, I felt the edge of uncertainty return, not about him, but about everything else. I should go back, I said, the words coming out before I fully processed them. Because a part of me still believed I had something to return to, something unfinished. He stopped then, not abruptly, just enough to make me stop too, and when he turned to face me, his expression had changed again, not colder, just more focused. Back to what? He asked, and the question should have been easy to answer, but it was not. Images came to mind instead of words. My apartment, the quiet that was not really quiet, the tension I had learned to read like a warning sign, the version of myself that moved carefully just to avoid conflict, and suddenly, saying it out loud felt impossible. I looked away for a second, then back at him. My life, I said finally, but even as I spoke, the words felt distant, like something I had already started to leave behind. He studied me for a moment, then shook his head slightly, not dismissing me, just correcting me. That is not a life, he said, and there was no judgment in his tone, just clarity, and for some reason, that made it harder to argue. I crossed my arms again, grounding myself. It is mine, I replied, and this time, he did not respond immediately. He stepped closer instead, not enough to invade, just enough to make sure I did not look away. Not anymore, he said quietly, and the certainty in those two words sent something through me that I could not name, not fear, not anger, something deeper, something that felt like the ground shifting under my feet. I took a small step back without thinking, needing space, needing something familiar. But there was nothing familiar here, not anymore. You cannot just decide that, I said, my voice steadier now, because I needed it to be. He held my gaze, unshaken. I already did, he replied, and there was no arrogance in it, no need to prove anything. Just fact, and that was what made it harder to push against. Silence stretched between us, but this time it was not shared, it was charged, filled with everything I did not understand yet, everything I was starting to realize. I exhaled slowly, forcing myself to think, to hold on to something that was still mine. What do you want from me? I asked, and for the first time since this began, there was a pause in him, small, but real, like the question mattered in a different way. He looked at me. Not through me, not past me, but directly at me, and when he spoke, his voice was lower, more deliberate. Nothing you do not already choose, he said, and the answer confused me more than anything else. He had said so far, because it did not feel like control, it felt like something else, something I could not define yet. I frowned slightly, trying to understand. That does not make sense, I said, and for a brief moment, something almost like a smile touched his expression, faint, controlled. But there, it will, he replied, and then, as if the conversation had already reached its conclusion, he turned slightly, gesturing toward the car again. For now, you stay where you are safe. The word. Safe again, always that word, and this time, I did not argue, not because I agreed, but because I realized something important. Arguing with him was not about winning or losing, It was about understanding the rules of a world I had already stepped into. I moved toward the car without hesitation this time, my thoughts quieter, more focused, and as I sat down, watching the door close again with that same final sound, I realized something I had been resisting since the beginning. This was not about being forced into anything, it was about being placed somewhere I had not chosen, and slowly, without fully noticing, beginning to choose it anyway. The drive back felt different this time, not quieter, not calmer, but clearer. Like something inside me had shifted into place without asking for permission. I watched the city pass by again, the same streets, the same lights, but they no longer felt like something I belonged to, they felt like something I was observing from the outside, and that realization should have scared me more than it did, but instead it settled into something steady, something I could not ignore anymore. When the car came to a stop and the gates opened once again, I did not hesitate. I stepped out before the door was fully held open, my movements more certain than they had been before, and I could feel it, the difference in the way I carried myself, not stronger, not yet, but no longer shrinking. He noticed, of course he did. He noticed everything. You are adapting, he said as we walked inside, his voice low, almost thoughtful, and I glanced at him briefly before looking ahead again. I am understanding, I replied, and that felt more accurate, because this was not about becoming part of his world. It was about recognizing what that world required. We moved through the space without interruption, everything continuing to function around him with quiet precision, and for the first time, I did not feel out of place in it. I felt aware of it, which was different. We stopped in the same room as before, and I paused just inside the doorway, taking in the stillness, the order, the sense that nothing here happened by accident. This is where you stay, he said behind me, not asking, not suggesting, just stating. I turned slightly, crossing my arms again. Out of habit, but this time it did not feel defensive, it felt like control, my control. And if I leave, I asked, not because I planned to, but because I needed to hear the answer. He stepped closer, stopping just short of where my space began, his gaze steady, unwavering. You can, he said, and for a brief second, something inside me lifted, but it did not last, because he continued, but you will come back. The certainty in his voice did not feel like a threat, it felt like a truth he had already accepted, and I realized then that he was not controlling my choices, he was predicting them, and that unsettled me more than anything else. I looked away for a moment, letting that settle, then back at him. You think you know me already, I said quietly, and he did not deny it, did not soften it. I know enough, he replied, and the simplicity of that answer made something in my chest tighten, not from fear, but from the uncomfortable sense of being seen in a way I was not used to. I took a slow breath, steadying myself, and then said the one thing that had been building since the moment this started. I am not something you can decide for. The words came out stronger than I expected, clearer, and for a moment, silence filled the space between us again, but this time it was not uncertain, it was deliberate. He held my gaze, and something in his expression shifted, not losing control, never that, but adjusting, like he was recalculating something important. No, he said. After a second, his voice quieter now, more precise. You are not, and that should have been the end of it, but he stepped slightly closer, just enough to make sure I heard what came next. But you are someone I protect. The words landed differently than everything else he had said so far. Not ownership, not control, something else, something that felt heavier because it was not demanded, it was decided. I felt it in the way my breath slowed, in the way my thoughts stilled just enough to process it. And for the first time since this began, I did not immediately push back. I just stood there, absorbing it, understanding that this was the line, the point where everything shifted from reaction to choice. I could walk away, maybe, I could try to return to what I had before, but the truth was already there, clear, undeniable. I had already changed, not because of him, but because of the moment I chose to stay. I looked at him one last time, steady, grounded in a way I had not been before, and quietly, without hesitation, I said, then do not decide everything for me. And something in his eyes responded to that, not surprise, not resistance, something closer to respect, subtle but real. He nodded once, a small movement that carried more meaning than any words. Then show me, he said, and as the room fell into silence again, I realized this was not the end of anything, it was the beginning of something I would have to define for myself, inside a world that had already claimed me the moment I refused to walk away.